this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In 1932, career diplomat Joseph Grew was posted to Japan as American ambassador. At the time, Japan was in crisis. Naval officers had assassinated the Prime Minister and conspiracies flourished. The military had a stranglehold on the government. War with Russia loomed. Not only was the country in turmoil, but its relationship with America was also rapidly deteriorating. For the next decade, Grew attempted to warn American leaders about the risks of Japan's raging nationalism and rising militarism, while also trying to stabilise Tokyo's increasingly erratic and volatile foreign policy. From domestic terrorism by Japanese extremists to the global rise of Hitler and the fateful attack on Pearl Harbor, the events that unfolded during Grew's tenure proved to be pivotal for Japan and the world in the run-up to World War II. So to discuss Joseph Grew and Japanese-American relationships in the run-up to the war, I'm joined by Steve Kempner. Steve is the author of Our Man in Tokyo, which draws on Grew's diary, correspondence, dispatches and first-hand Japanese accounts to lay out the road to war. Steve, welcome. Thanks for joining me. So we're going to be looking at the US ambassador in Tokyo. Let's start with, who was Joseph Grew? How did he get to become the US ambassador to Tokyo? Because it strikes me as being one of the more important postings.
Well, at the time, it was the most difficult, challenging post in the world because it was just before the Nazis really took off in Germany. The militarists in Japan were of greater concern than the Nazis were in the early 1930s. And that was because they had invaded Manchuria in 1931 without bothering to inform the civilian government in Tokyo that they were going to do that. So that's when Grew got the call from President Herbert Hoover to take this post. Before that, to give you a little background about him, he grew up in a wealthy American family in Boston, went to Groton, the famous prep school here, and then like his father and his brothers before him, he went to Harvard. And when he got out, he was expected to go into banking or business in Boston, because that's what the Grews did. And instead, Joseph told his father, "That bores me to death. I'm not going to do that." His father said, you can have a year. And when you come back with some sense in your head, you go to work on State Street in Boston. And instead, he went to the Far East and had a lot of adventures, climbed mountains, shot animals, got malaria. And when he got back, he told his dad, "I haven't changed my mind. It's the Foreign Service for me, not State Street." So that's how he got into it. And he served in many different posts in the State Department. He was there in the 20s when it made the transition to a professional foreign service. Not totally professional, because there were still and still are patronage jobs throughout the State Department and ambassadorships. But anyway, he became one of the strong advocates for a professional foreign service. And he served as ambassador to Denmark, Switzerland, and he was in Turkey as ambassador when he got the call to go to Japan.
So when he arrives in Japan, was he sent with an agenda of what Washington was trying to achieve?
They wanted him to get the Japanese out of Manchuria. They wanted him to go over there and say that we're really upset about this. It's not right. We can't support it. We won't ever recognize a government that was taken by force. And so get them out of there, negotiate a withdrawal. And it only took Grew a month or two to realize that that's never going to happen. They're not going to leave. And he told them that. They said, well, do what you can. He kept sending memos and evaluations and alarming dispatches, which got, of course, more and more alarming as the 1930s went on. So his initial mission was, he realized right away, impossible. And then it only got worse from there. You mentioned the rise of of Hitler in the 30s. So in Europe, and I think it's a good point I'd not really considered, but that's in the book. The power lies with sort of Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin or Franco. So who's driving policy in Japan? Is there a political, a dominant political figure where the power lies? No, and that's, you put your finger on something very important, especially important for an ambassador. The power centers in Japan were dispersed. And so to figure out where the levers were and which ones to pull and which ones would have an effect and which ones would come up the lemons was very difficult for him to figure out, because it was the palace. The imperial palace had tremendous power, political power. The politicians had tremendous power, the cabinet in particular. The military had tremendous power. The man called the Genro, Prince Saionji, who was the emperor's principal advisor, and the emperor would never select a new prime minister without the Genro's recommendation and approval. And that's also a peculiarity. The emperor is the one who appoints the prime minister, not the parties, not the people. And the emperor himself is this conundrum that Gru had to figure out. He's a divinity, according to the Japanese. He was a direct descendant of the first emperor who was sent down by the sun goddess 2,600 years earlier, except that the story was only a century old. So, and he was perfect. He was a god. He couldn't, and because he was a god, he was infallible. And to keep him infallible, he couldn't make any decisions. He wasn't allowed to make any decisions. And he's the head of government. He's the head of state. He's the commander-in-chief. He's the spiritual leader. So he's got this tremendous power in theory, and yet he's not the center of power. So Gru was grabbing at smoke a lot of times, trying to figure out, who do I talk to that's going to actually influence what happens here.
Yeah, it is remarkably complicated. How does he get along with the Japanese? Does he speak Japanese? Does he have good relations? He was one of those affable sort of ambassadors.
Well, to take the easy one first, he did not speak Japanese. He spoke many other languages. But he decided when he got to Japan and realized how complicated the society was and the politics were, he didn't want to make a crucial blunder by attempting to speak Japanese, which is a very difficult language to learn. So I think very wisely he decided, I will use interpreters. And the other thing is, many of the Japanese leaders spoke English. Many of them had been educated in the West, in Britain, or in America, and they often sent their sons there to be educated. So sometimes he didn't need a translator. So that's the easy part of your question. The other part was, he got along with them very well. They liked him. They understood that he was actually trying to understand their position. He was empathetic to their difficulties, their lack of natural resources, their need for imports, their need for exports to sell goods to other countries so they could afford to buy what they needed to continue this industrial giant that they had become. And because without those imports, they were doomed. And the Japanese knew that, and that drove their foreign policy, particularly in terms of oil and coal and things that you need to fuel industry. They liked Gru. They thought he wanted to represent them truly to Washington. And he liked them. He had many good friends in Japan. One of his principles of diplomacy was personal relationships matter. It can help people make decisions in rooms, small rooms, because they trust each other. And of course, all that gets blown away when you're dealing with ideologues and fanatics and people of that sort. He
does come across as a character who's very sympathetic, and everybody seems sympathetic to him, which, considering the ultimate outcome, makes you wonder how sort of it got there, because no one part of it seems as radical on its own. It's like a badly played game of chess with an awful outcome.
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting point. Gru often wrote back to Secretary of State Hall and told his friends, there are many Japanese here who do not want bad relations with the United States and Britain and Europe, but they have no power. They have no say because they're just being steamrolled by the fanatics. And so it just was this momentum that eventually Gru could not push back hard enough against.
Mm. You mentioned Hull there. Gru's appointed by Hoover, and then Roosevelt gets to power in 33. Is it the election of 33?
Elected in 32, took power 33.
So Roosevelt keeps him on, and I wasn't sure if that was normal. I mean, I know you're moving towards a professional diplomatic postings. Is that unusual to keep them on? I mean, and was there a vision of their relationship with Japan aligned?
I wouldn't call it normal. I wouldn't call it abnormal. I think it depends on the person. Well, it's a case by case. And Gru did know Roosevelt. They were opposite political parties, Grew Republican, Roosevelt, of course, a Democrat, but they knew each other from Groton and from Harvard. Roosevelt was 2 years behind him, so they called each other Joe and Frank. They weren't friends, but they knew each other. So I think there was some basis there for commonality. And when Roosevelt came into power, Grew, in fact, wrote a letter saying he didn't know if Frank was going to be up to the task he was going to be facing, but he hoped that he would reappoint him because he thought the job was way too important to hand off as a patronage job to somebody. And Roosevelt evidently agreed. He reappointed Grew, and he reappointed him 3 times. So finally, Grew became a strong admirer of Roosevelt. He thought he was handling foreign policy very well for most of the time that Roosevelt was in power. So they did align with each other eventually.
I couldn't work out if from the start he was being ignored. It's Hull, isn't it? Cordell Hull he's dealing with through Roosevelt's administration. I couldn't work out if from the start he was being ignored in the State Department, or if Hull's policy was to Japan was slightly different from Roosevelt's, which I think is probably Roosevelt probably had his hands full with a lot of internal problems in the 30s rather than Japan.
He did. He was, of course, battling the Depression, trying to bring the country out of the Depression. And then as that started to happen, he started to become more concerned about Germany and Europe, because that's, they were our closer allies than Japan was. And Hitler was more alarming than any one person in Japan. So Roosevelt focused his foreign attention on Europe and sort of left Asia to Cordell Hull, which was fine because they essentially agreed on everything. And to get to your initial question, they sort of ignored Grew, and this is a puzzle to me, and it was to Grew as well. They didn't treat him seriously enough because I don't think they were taking Japan quite seriously enough until the late 30s, so that they would, for instance, send important information in a circular telegram, which would go to China first, and I forget where else, but finally it would get to Grew at the end. And by the time Grew got it, he had often heard this news from the British ambassador or somebody. And that really annoyed Grew, as you can imagine. He said, these are serious things. Give me the information I need. And then they also started to, as the 30s rolled on, they began to think that maybe Grew was a little too empathetic with the Japanese, that the phrase, maybe he had gone native, that maybe he was more interested, especially after Munich, in appeasement. And that word started being tossed around in relationship to Grew, which annoyed him even more because Grew was not an appeaser. He was a diplomat and an ambassador. He never soft-soaped U.S. policies, and he didn't soft-soap his own opinions. And he never advocated just totally surrendering to the Japanese demands as had happened at Munich with the Germans. He wanted what he called constructive conciliation. We propose these things. If they live up to them, we loosen things a little more. We stop the embargo on steel if they do this. If they don't, we put an embargo on something else. So it was a risk and reward for Grew, and that's not the policy that the U.S. chose.
Well, is the U.S. policy really wanting to maintain the status quo with Japan, whilst Japan's really wanting to be treated as one of the great powers? Any mileage in that thought?
They were one of the great powers, and that was one of the things Grew kept trying to emphasize to Washington. He said, they have the best army in the world. We need to take it seriously. We need to bulk up our Navy. We need to improve our Army. They are the most impressive army in the world, and they're putting 50% of their budget into the military. That's not a good sign for what their plans are. And I forget the first part of your question.
Do the Americans really want to maintain the status quo as the Japan?
Well, that was the idea, but obviously that was ludicrous. Japan was totally interested in upending the status quo. They said the status quo is white imperialism. We've had enough of that. We want a new order, and that's what they called it, a new order for East Asia. And you better get on board with it, because if you don't, you're going to get left behind and there might be a conflict. When you're reading history, you look from far away, you can see these trains they started in early 30s and they're on the same track and they're heading into a dark tunnel. It's not good what's going to happen.
I was kind of thinking they never get quite treated as equals, do they? I know it's not really covered in the book. In the naval agreements, post First World War naval agreements, never quite treat Japan as well as certainly the US seems to come up better than everybody else. But there you go.
Well, there was a reason for that. I mean, the idea behind that original naval treaty was Britain and the U.S. had to defend two oceans. Britain had its colonies, and the U.S. had both coasts. Japan only had one ocean. Therefore, Japan didn't need as big a navy as the other two powers. And the idea was to stop an arms race, to stop a naval arms race that would debilitate the finances of all the countries and possibly lead to conflict. It was a good idea. On the other hand, Japan started chafing at the idea that we are a great power and we deserve to have as big a navy as you do. And that became a sore point. And so the naval treaty collapsed, I believe, was it 34, 36? As
Japan's flexing its muscles then in the 30s, when do they start to look beyond just China? Because they have a statement saying it's an intent that they suggest they should take over the foreign policy of other countries within the immediate area, including China.
It was pretty clear they intended to, if not take over everything in East Asia, at least to control it. And so Manchuria was the first, and then northern China, and then the Sino-Japanese War began. Then they went down into Indochina, northern Indochina, French Indochina, and then southern Indochina. Gru called it the nibbling policy, that they're just nibbling off pieces of Asia, and we're going to have to do something to stop them, or conflict is inevitable. But Matsuoka, the guy who became the most troublesome foreign minister that Gru dealt with, said that Japan should have hegemony over Oceania. And he included in that Australia, Hawaii, the Philippines. But he said, but we will let you have Australia and we will let you have Hawaii. You just stay on your side of the Pacific and we'll stay on ours and everything will be great. And that was not acceptable to the U.S. government.
So this nibbling away, we've sort of said there's nobody directly in charge of anything driving policy in Japan. How is it playing out internally in Japan? Because presumably not all factions are pulling in the same direction, wanting war, and presumably sort of these ideas of imperialist ideas.
It's a good question, and it's a complicated answer, I'm afraid. Again, there were people in Japan who called themselves moderates, and they did not want a war. They wanted good relations with the West, but they also wanted Japan to control East Asia. That became the mantra of the country, even for moderate Japanese politicians and people. Now, the rest of Japan, by the mid-30s, was swept up in war fever, in imperial egomania, and they wanted Asia. And they had a censored press. They didn't get foreign stories that weren't chopped to pieces. The foreign news was censored. The radio news was censored. They only got news that supported that view, that the West doesn't want to give us our just rewards. Everything we're doing is for peace. That's the one that kills me, that we are a peaceful nation. All we want is peace. Why can't people understand that? I mean, we're only using bombs because we want peace. It's that logic that just, doesn't make any sense. So by the time that the late 30s come around, Japan is mostly united around the idea that we need to expand. We're endangered. We're being encircled by the West. Another absurdity, which they borrowed that phrase from Hitler. The only people who were expanding and bombing were the Japanese. And yet they were the victims. They were somehow the ones that were under attack, which is sort of a right-wing meme. It happens, it happens all the time. That's how you unite people. Make them afraid, make them feel like they're under duress and we need to sacrifice and just trust us. We know what we're doing.
So that idea of them being encircled, is that what pushes them into the anti-Comintern pact with Germany in 1936?
No, I think that was just common hatred of communism. they were an imperial country. They had an emperor, and they saw what the Bolsheviks had done to to the Tsar, and they said, these people are dangerous. We have to stomp them out. We can't let them get near our God. So let's unite with anyone we can to control them. And, the Communist Party, communism in Japan socialism in Japan was almost non-existent, but that was the bogeyman that constantly came up when the military needed to point fingers at someone. It was the communists, the socialists, and the Westerners. They were the threats.
Well, presumably, America was the largest trading partner with Japan. Did the signing of the pact, change things for GRU? Did that diminish his influence in Japan? Did it give sort of Germany a boost?
It definitely gave Germany a boost. After that pact was signed, swastikas started showing up in Tokyo. German became popular foreign language. Travel magazines featured German destinations. The speeches of Hitler began being broadcast on the one radio station that the government allowed in Japan. So it definitely gave a boost to Germany, and it also gave a boost to the military because they were entranced by Hitler's strongman military totalitarian plans and personality. Whether it diminished GRU, I don't know if I could say that. It made his job more intense and difficult, but he was still, he still had contacts at the highest echelons of the government, and they all spoke to him.
I would say he's there for such a long period of time. I can't help but think that certainly by the end, I mean, his little black book of who's who must have just bumped into everybody at some point. It was a tremendously long posting.
Yeah, but that did change. Like in 1940, 1939, 1940 on, it became dangerous to start speaking to Americans. It became dangerous for Japanese to come to the embassy. And so GRU, military attachés, commercial naval attachés, they all began losing their contacts because people were starting to be afraid to talk to them because they would be brought in by the police. So what are you saying? What did you tell them? What's going on? And everything was a secret. It was a totalitarian government. So if you give any information, it's almost certainly related to national security. It's that paranoia that began to be so pronounced in Japan, which shut down communication between GRU and other people in Japan. He still had his contacts, though. He had one of his best friend in Japan was Count Kabayama, and a graduate of Amherst College here in the U.S., and that small Ivy League college, they call it. And he knew people in the palace, the government. He was everywhere. And he was GRU's inside man to the government to the very end.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Steve Kepner, and we're talking about Joseph GRU, the American ambassador to Japan. He's continually complaining about attacks on Americans and American trading interests and American ships in China. I mean, throughout the whole of this period, China is just, which I don't think is particularly well understood in the general historiography, public sort of popular historiography. China bubbling away in the background is behind everything, and GRU seems to have been continually raising concerns about to the Japanese. Were they listening? Did he have leverage to for them to stop what they all claimed was accidental attacks, which didn't seem very accidental, the amount of them?
No, he was not successful in stopping them. And there were a couple of brief pauses, but it never stopped. And that's one of the most surprising things to me. You mentioned it's not that well known. I was shocked at how often the Japanese military had provoked the United States by bombing U.S. properties in China, missions, schools, hospitals, embassies, ships. The USS Panay, which was a gunboat on the Yangtze, was sunk by Japanese fighter planes. They claimed that they didn't see that it was an American boat, despite the huge stars and stripes flying from the mast, the flags draped over the deck, the flags painted on the sides, crystal clear day. We didn't see it. We thought we didn't know. Well, what about the Army boats that came up after the boat started to sink and started to machine gun the side of the boat? I guess they were pretty myopic too. So it was absurd. By the time, like 1940, every time a new foreign minister came in, and Grew dealt with 17 different foreign ministers. That's how often the cabinet fell. He would hand them this list of outrages that had been done by the Japanese military. And by 1940, there were over 300 incidents like this. That was really surprising to me. And the warnings kept coming. You have to stop this. You have to quit it. You don't do it anymore. Something bad's going to happen. And then when we would do something like shut off the Commerce Treaty, the Japanese were shocked. Why'd you do that? What did we do? That was always the response.
It's quite hard because I think today, if these things happened today, it would have been all over the press. There'd be clamouring for military action. You might have had a limited airstrike. There's all these responses that would have been pretty quick. But at this period, they kind of seemed to take it. And I wondered if it was almost like the Japanese saw it as a loss of face from America by not retaliating other than a stern word. And that encouraged them to keep nibbling away.
That's what Grew kept telling our government. He said, I can do all the diplomacy in the world over here, but if it's not backed up by anything, they don't take it seriously. And they didn't. They believed that the U.S. government was a nation of isolationists and pacifists, and they would never allow Roosevelt to go into a war. And they thought that way, partly because Japan kept doing all these things and it was reported in the press, and also because all of the outrage that was being expressed in America was never reported in the Japanese press. The Japanese had no idea that Americans were getting more and more angry about these things. That's a pretty bad problem when your communication is only in one direction. Grew, on the other hand, was telling the U.S. government, who didn't take Japan as seriously as it should have militarily. They didn't think that Japan would dare ever attack the mighty United States. And Grew said, they might. They're crazy. And they have the ability to do it, and we need to be prepared. And that, I think, eventually was getting through to Roosevelt and to Hull. And so they didn't want war. They didn't want a conflict in the Pacific, partly because they didn't want to save Britain's bacon. They didn't want to get sucked into the war. And they also didn't think that American military was ready for a war, especially an ocean war. And that's why Roosevelt eventually in the 1930s, he finally got Congress to allow him to have a big budget to make more ships and to improve the Army. And, and then a lot of them got sunk in Pearl Harbor.
So you mentioned before the trade agreement with Japan, and the US gave notice on this in sort of 1939. What effect does that have on Japan?
Well, what it does is it puts a gun to Japan's head. But they were a most favored nation. That means that their imports and exports weren't taxed. The tariff wasn't put on them because they were a favored nation. When that goes away, that means that at any moment, the United States can say, oh, your silk, your textiles, your clothing, everything you're sending over here, at any second, we could put a huge tax on it, which would make it unaffordable for Americans to buy. And therefore, you're not going to get any income. And so that was a threat that Hull wanted. He said, I'm not going to put the tariff on yet. And the yet was the big word, and it made Japan very nervous. They were shocked that the U.S. could consider doing this to them after being warned over and over and over that we were going to do something just like that if they didn't stop.
I wondered how it was viewed in Japan, because it's not a militaristic move. When the Japanese are bombing things and attacking things, this is a diplomatic move. Is it sneaky?
Well, it's pretty clear, though. It's sneaky, yes. But it's clear. It's the hammer above your head, and be careful. And that didn't work. And so then you start to embargo steel and oil, and then you freeze Japanese assets. I mean, it was all of these things that are still used throughout the world to discourage violence and aggression. They're economic disincentives, and none of them worked. It just made Japan more and more desperate and angry.
You mentioned before how anti-communist Japan was, which pushed them into the agreement with Germany. The Germans then signed the Anti-Aggression Pact in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which then align Germany and Russia together. Is that the Japanese not having a slap in the face from white Western Europe?
Yeah, It was a slab. Grew and Hull both said, look, this is your chance to get out of this pact. This is your chance. You can renounce them. You can come back towards us. And instead, Japan went full speed back to Hitler. They stopped for a moment. The swastikas became a little less popular. But then when Hitler started winning battles and taking Europe, the Japanese military said, wow, this is our golden moment. Europe is busy with Hitler. Let's get busy taking what we want over here.
Did the war in Europe work to unify the factions with Japan? Because presumably barriers are disappearing to prevent them achieving certain goals. As you say, European eyes are elsewhere.
It did. It really just became irresistible. There were still politicians who didn't want to antagonize the West by taking Hong Kong or Singapore. But there were other people, the military, and they ended up winning, saying, no, this is when we have to do it because the U.S. won't come into the war. They're pacifists, and Britain's too busy. In fact, and the rest of Europe is gone. The French aren't going to do anything. Dutch aren't going to do anything. And the British are too busy, so they can't help. So let's take what we want. At the same time, and this also was something I didn't realize because I was largely ignorant about the Pacific side of this stuff. I think we all know a lot more about the European side, the Nazi side. I didn't realize that Japan and Germany weren't joined at the hip throughout the whole thing. That wasn't true at all. Japan really resisted joining Hitler in a military way. They said, no, we will come in when we want to, and you don't get to tell, because Hitler was always pushing, look, if I do something, you need to come in with me. And the Japanese said, no, we're not going to do that. We will make the decision on our own, because Japan had its own agenda, its own plans, and it didn't want to have to help with the European war. It wanted to just establish its sovereignty over Asia.
What hadn't occurred to me, again, fascinating fact you brought out in the book, is that we've talked about Japan being at war in and around China since the 30s. How very war-weary the country was.
They had 1 million soldiers in China by 1939, 1 million soldiers. And the casualties in that war were just atrocious, just horrifying for the Chinese more than for the Japanese. But Japan's a lot smaller country. And it wasn't just the human carnage, it was also the economic carnage in Japan, where everything was scarce, so that Japanese couldn't get polished white rice, which is the basis of their diet. All the polished white rice went to the military. You couldn't get coffee, you couldn't get clothing, you couldn't get metal parts, they were cutting metal buttons off of jackets, send them to the factories to melt down. All the wrought iron in the streets and the lampposts, they all got torn down to make armaments. And it was terrible, really, what the Japanese faced. And Grew, however, kept telling Washington, because Washington thought that these economic disincentives were going to bring Japan to its knees. And Grew said, no, you don't understand the Japanese. They will fight. They will do whatever they need to do, because they will defend their emperor, really, until the last child attempts to stab the last soldier with a stick. That's what they will do to defend this country. And he wasn't taken seriously for a long time about that, and it was true.
I can't work out, actually, did Japan want war with the US? Because it didn't, because they do sort of make some half-assed moves to try and keep the peace in 41, don't they?
Well, half-assed, yeah, maybe that's generous. There was the one moment in the summer of 1941, late summer, early fall, when the Prime Minister Konoye wanted a secret meeting with Roosevelt, and he agreed to do that on American territory, and he had the backing of the Army and the Navy. And he said, I will make proposals that are irresistible, and we will save the peace. And Grew, of course, was very excited about this idea, and Cordell Hull killed it. He said, the only way that we will meet with you is if you first get out of China, get out of Indochina. He made all of these preconditions, and Grew said, you can't do that. Let's go have the meeting, see what happens. And then if nothing happens, then we can start ramping up what we need to do. It was very frustrating. I think that's the most frustrating aspect of Gru's entire tenure in Japan was the refusal of the United States to take that proposal seriously and to see what, if anything, could have come from it. Maybe nothing, but you never know until you listen and try it. It was the diplomatic idea that Gru had, and Hull's inflexible principles would not allow that to happen. Now, this is mostly all the Japanese fault. I'm not blaming the Americans, but this was an opening that was not pried further open. And Gru thought that was a shame. Meanwhile, the Japanese, while they were proposing this, were also preparing to invade southern Indochina. So they were untrustworthy, and you can see why Hull said, nothing they say is ever done. It's all lies. They lied to get whatever they want. Why would I believe them about this? He had a good point. So did Gru, though. Go listen. Let's listen. At least listen. That was a tragedy of miscommunication and bad moves.
To what point does war become unavoidable? Is it when the Prime Minister changes to Tojo, or?
Yeah, I think it became unavoidable really when the meeting between Konoye and FDR was finally killed. That was in by the middle of October. It became clear to the Japanese they're stalling. They're not going to meet. We're not going to meet with FDR. And so then Konoye, who was a fragile man, quit. And so that's when Tojo came in as prime minister. And that's when things accelerated. And to answer your question, I didn't quite answer it. Japan didn't want a full-fledged war with the United States. What their plan was, and Pearl Harbor was, hit them, cripple them so badly, and scare them so badly that they will come to the negotiating table and we will get what we want in Asia, and that will be the end of it. And you bomb America, and that's not what happens.
The two countries just think extremely differently, and and it's this strange divide that it must have been extremely frustrating for Gru in the middle, when you could see that there's no meeting because culturally they're doing different things. I don't think I've expressed that very well, but throughout the book, you kind of think, oh God, he must be thankless sat there.
Yeah, he ended feeling like a failure because an ambassador's primary job is to keep peace between his country and the host country. And he started writing a book, making notes towards a book while he was there, and the title was Failure of a Mission. But he also thought that he had done everything he possibly could to stop that failure from happening. So you're right, it was frustrating for him.
When war breaks out, what happens to the embassy? Is there some sort of protocol to allow the embassy and the staffs to be repatriated, or what happens to them?
Negotiations, of course, and on both sides. The Japanese diplomats were put into a nice country club in West Virginia. The U.S. diplomats were more or less incarcerated in the embassy in Tokyo. They spent 6 months there. The negotiations dragged on and on and on. I'm not sure why. Gru thought they'd be out by Valentine's Day in February, but he lost a $10 bet on that one. They didn't leave until June. It was a long time for them to be incarcerated. And of course, they only got heat like a couple of hours a day during the winter. They got enough food. They weren't mistreated. And Gru had a massive wine cellar, and he was damned if he was going to leave that for the Japanese. So he distributed his wine cellar to all the messes inside the embassy. And after 6 months, there were still some left. So that gives you some idea of the extent of his wine cellar. The negotiations took quite a while, and then the ships met in Africa and Mozambique and got off of one ship, one group, and got onto the other ship, and then each ship went back to its respective country, and that's how the exchange was made.
What did you do when you returned to the US?
For the first year or so, he was sent back, Cordell Hull, on a barnstorming tour around the country to talk about Japan and what they were like. And, it was a propaganda mission, really. He got attention everywhere. I think he made 250 speeches in that first year. Everybody wanted to hear what this man, who knew more about Japan than anybody, had to say about the enemy. And what he told them was, first of all, don't underestimate Japan. You think it's a small country and we're going to win? You have no idea how tough these people are and how hard this is going to be. Second, they're led by a bunch of fanatics. unless they are rooted out and destroyed, Japan will never be a civilized country again that we can trust. And third, there are many people in Japan who didn't want this war. And please don't forget that there are good people there. That last part was eventually cut because it didn't fit with the propaganda message. I think Grew understood that.
Did he help draft or came up with some suggestions for drafting the peace that were rejected?
Yeah, he did. By the summer of 1945, Grew was Assistant Secretary of State, which means second in charge at the State Department. And he worked with a couple of other people to come up with the terms for the surrender of Japan. Everybody knew they were going to lose except Japan. Japan was refusing to give up. And Groot managed to get inserted into the Potsdam terms that the emperor as an institution would be allowed to continue, because he said, not necessarily Hirohito, but the emperor as an honorary position. He said, otherwise Japan will never surrender. They will not surrender until the last one is dead. And so invading Japan, everyone knew, would be a total nightmare. But by the time Truman got over to Potsdam with Stalin and Churchill and the others, the atomic bomb had been tested successfully. We no longer needed to invade Japan, and that provision about the emperor had been removed from the Potsdam terms. So consequently, the Japanese refused to surrender, as Grew said they would. And then the bombs went off, and finally the emperor said, we are going to surrender, but the emperorship must be retained somehow. And so Grew had a hand in putting in language vague enough that allowed it to, as a institution, to remain as a powerless institution with no claims of divinity and absolutely no influence on the government. And that's when Japan said, okay, we surrender.
Well, Steve, with the surrender of Japan, that seems like a good place to finish. Thank you. Loyal listener, if you want to read about Joseph Grew, the book to get is Our Man in Tokyo. I will have a link on the website and in the show notes. Just before I go, just a quick mention of Patreon. Please do consider becoming a patron of the show. $1 or £1 from listeners like you really does help me keep the show going. And you can find me at patreon.com/WW2 podcast. Well, that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice